bad. So sorry if a little distracted, but we'll get through this really quickly. Wanted to provide you with some information on some of the shared street, closed streets. We've been calling them temporary recreation streets internally, or TRECs, that the city of Denver has done. And just kind of get into the methodology, the execution, and a little bit of the evaluation. So eager to get into it and chat with you all. Next slide, please. It feels like a lifetime ago at this point, but kind of right around the start of when we were ordered to stay at home, we started seeing a problem where we realized that people in Denver are very outdoorsy. It's very difficult to keep them inside, and people are naturally going to gravitate outside to recreate, to run, to walk, to bike, rollerblade, skateboard, all of that you've seen. Very few locations of our sidewalks are actually 6 foot or wider to provide for kind of compliant passing. So we did notice quite a lot of people were actually entering the street. And so we wanted to close down some of these streets and make it safer for people on bikes and just walking to actually be in the road and not have to worry about speeding traffic. And so that's where we started with as a problem statement, is just kind of providing a little bit extra space for people to recreate during the stay-at-home order. Next slide, please. Jumping right into it, a lot of opportunities like we talked about. Wanted to provide additional space for people to recreate, especially while maintaining the social distancing requirements. We were seeing quite a lot of crowding on our paths and trails, and also our parks. And then, the city of Denver is very blessed to have quite a large park and trail system, but that does not mean that every single resident has convenient access to that. There still are quite a few gaps. And so we wanted to make sure that individuals did have that space if they don't live immediately next to a park. With those opportunities, there's quite a lot of challenges. We have to worry about emergency response, any sort of utility work. We're promoting deliveries. We had to worry about people that did need to leave for essential work. And then we also were working about ADA, and then actually, building an environment where people would want to actually kind of gather and socialize like a typical open street or a cyclovia. So we were trying to kind of hit a very fine line here. Next slide, please. And then this is one where we'll kind of just jump into the methodology to show you kind of the data-driven results we had. And so the two kind of distinct types we were looking at here is first off, the park deserts. So we wanted to understand which areas of the city did not have a convenient 5-mile walking ability to enter a park. And then we also heard from a lot of our park rangers that several of our more popular parks were receiving overcrowding. People were looking for open space to be outside in a safe distance, and naturally areas where our parks and houses were most dense were receiving a lot of overcrowding, and people weren't able to spread out 6 feet. So we wanted to look at that and see how we could close adjacent streets and provide additional space. Next slide. So here is a map showing basically every parkway and park that Denver has with a 5-minute walking buffer expanded out from each. As you can see, we've got pretty good coverage area, but there still are some fairly large gaps. In particular, what's shown here are the gaps with residential density underlaid. And so we couldn't close down a street in every single gap. So we wanted to primarily focus on locations that had the most amount of people living in those areas because they were under the most duress. Next slide, please. And then because equity is at the utmost importance for what we do at DOTI, we also wanted to make sure we had the equity lens, which actually is a bit of a mirror from our density. And so not a ton of equity downtown, but more so kind of the inverted L. So we wanted to isolate a couple locations as well that we could put in some of our more equitable challenged locations to make sure we are meeting that need as well. Next slide. These were the 3 parks that we had identified working with our parks team that received or was getting the most use and had the most overcrowding. So we had Watch Park, Sloan's Lake, and Cheeseman Park, and this is just kind of a quick graphic isolating some of the streets we would ultimately consider to kind of close down for connections. Next slide. Because once we kind of figured out the general areas that these needed to be, we needed to narrow them down to individual street locations. And we did that through a number of ways. First and foremost, to make sure that vehicular speeds and actual volumes were already fairly low on these. We wanted to make sure that they were primarily local streets. We also wanted to avoid any sort of commercial areas. We were really promoting deliveries and things like that of the sort at the time. And so we didn't want to make it more complicated for delivery drivers. So we tried to avoid as much commercial areas as we could. We could not impact any transit. And so any sort of transit route on streets automatically disqualified them. And then because a lot of these locations actually do cross some of our busier streets, some of our collectors and our arterials, we wanted to make sure that where they did cross those more busy streets, that it was done in an area where it was safer, where there was a signal, so you didn't have to play frog or to cross over. And then also we just kind of used, the decades of experience that we have at the city of Denver and kind of, this street will work better than that street, that sort of thing. Next slide. What we ended up going with is we kind of plugged in the number of streets that met those criteria. We had quite a few and we wanted to prioritize them, which ones kind of bubble up the most at the top. So we provided a prioritization methodology that ended up mixing kind of both residential density and equity as well to kind of see what bubbled up at the top. Next slide. And yeah, this is just kind of a sneak peek of what that is. As you can see, some of the places ranked higher in equity, some of them ranked higher in residential density, and we ended up going with a combination of both. Next slide. This is kind of a graphic here showing phase 1 through 4 that we had identified. We took kind of some rough estimates on the total number of devices that we would need. And some of the original cost estimates, we were really projecting only 30 days at the onset. And they've become so popular that now we've blown past that date and we will continue to do so. And we had phase 1 and phase 2 installed for the better part of the first month. And then this week, we finally received approval and the ability to actually roll out phase 3 and phase 4 right now. And we're currently working on potentially looking at a few alternative locations as well to even expand into a phase 5 and a phase 6. Next slide. After we did the planning work and actually identified some of these corridors, we brought in our engineering friends to actually kind of vet the recommendations. I'm gonna actually look at it from a traffic engineering standpoint. And so we had to look for active construction, any planned paving over the next couple months, any access, ADA safety issues. And then ultimately we had our field inspectors physically go out there and take a look, since a lot of our analysis had been behind a computer screen at that point. Want to give a shout out to the Denver City Traffic Engineering Group. They did an excellent job. They turned around about 5 miles of these in about 2 days, which is record time for any sort of traffic control plan. And so really big shout out to them for doing that. And then also them just kind of embracing the fact that at the peak of COVID, our traffic volumes were about 20%, 20 to 30% of what they normally are. And so they had to kind of switch hats and go from, what sort of safety and closure measures do we need on a typical street versus kind of what do we need in the COVID era right now when we have even less traffic than normal. Next slide. Yeah, and then we once that was done, we brought in our implementation team to actually make these a reality. And so we ended up not having too many of these type 3 barricades depicted here that we had stored. And so we actually had to end up using a contractor. I know many other cities around the nation, some of them do actually have these in-house. And so different options there. We actually used a lot of our staff that had been repurposed during COVID, particularly like our traffic enforcement officers. We weren't writing tickets for several weeks. And so we repurposed them for installing signage, to talking to the community, removing some of the signs and repurposing them as needed. And then we had a bit of a phase rollout. First week was kind of phase 1, second week was phase 2. And like I discussed recently, a couple weeks after, we were getting into phase 3 and phase 4. Next slide. And then communication. Unfortunately, we weren't able to, have far-reaching public outreach. We weren't really able to do a lot of the typical outreach that we do at the city of Denver, just because at that point we was very much all about COVID, and they didn't want to kind of throw too much out there at once. And so basically the most we were able to do at the moment was just through signage. And so we developed kind of a shared street, slow down, you know, everyone kind of share the road equally sign that was located on just about every type 3 barrier we have out there. And then we also provided kind of some yard sign type things on the right. You can see, just to remind people that, you know, even though you are allowed to recreate and be in the street, that, you know, please still, as a reminder, keep your 6 feet. And this was also before any sort of face cloth coverings or anything like that. And so we didn't have that signage at the time. Next slide, please. Yeah, and then get into maintenance. So a little bit surprised, but maybe we shouldn't have been, is that it's one thing to do all this planning and get it out there. It's another to maintain it every single day. Particularly some neighborhoods are a little bit better than others. Some of them, you know, move some of the barriers out of the way so it's easier for them to drive through. Some locations, they actually took some of these barriers and hid them from us, which was really interesting. But on the other side, actually, in the Marion Parkway area, some people took these barriers and actually put them up on their own streets. And so they were making their own kind of versions of these temporary recreation streets. So it kind of shows, you know, just people of all types, but generally speaking has been overwhelmingly popular. Just some people decide they need to get out of their car and shove these to the side. But our inspectors go out there every single day. We actually have a contracting crew that goes out there several times a day. And then also our area inspectors do that as well. And so we really need to visit each one of these probably 3 to 4 times a day, just to make sure that they are staying in place and they are being used as intended and not moved out of the way so cars can go through and speed through them, since that's not the intention. Next slide, please. And here are the results. We were able to get, like I said, about 5.5 miles of the local streets that we closed out there: 11th, 16th, Marion, Bayard, Irving, Byron, Stewart, and Bowling. And then we also work with our friends over in Parks, and we loaned them some type 3 barricades, and they were actually able to close 10.7 miles within the streets. And then with phase 3 and phase 4 coming in, we should have about 7 to 8 miles out total after the end of this week. And we are looking for a few more. I think I may have one more slide. Yeah, and then finally, since these things have been out for a few weeks, we have put out traffic control devices. Both the city has put some out, and the Denver Street Partnership has been nice enough to use their equipment and provide us some data as well. As you can see, this is just about as much proof as you need of if you build it, they will come. The top graphic is probably the most relevant here. As you can see, the dotted orange line at the top is typical vehicular volume, and our bike and ped data is actually higher than that. So we are getting more people biking, walking, rollerblading, what have you, in the street when we are properly closing it down to through traffic and just making it safer for people to be out there than cars are typically out there, which is incredibly impressive. And it's about a 10 to 15 multiplier increase than what we clearly see out there. And then the bottom graphic just depicts that we are still recording data every day to see if there is any sort of surge in traffic. If there is a big surge, then there could be some safety issues. But while a lot of the traffic in other parts of the city has, you know, pretty much gotten back to where it normally is, we're between 70 to 80% of what it typically is. These streets that we've designated as these temporary recreation streets, these T-Rexes, traffic really has not returned. And so it really kind of proves the point that many of our streets could be turned into much safer streets, and it really won't impact our larger transportation network if done thoughtfully and executed appropriately. And that's all I've got.
Okay. So thank you very much, Jay. Now, Jay has an exciting event to get to, so we rearranged the agenda. Jay, could you just tell everyone what that event is, and I will forward a couple questions to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry for the last minute. The mayor has decided to implement a Black Lives Matter mural over by the city capitol, and so we are closing down, probably should be closed as of about 5-10 minutes ago, Broadway between 14th and Colfax. And we will be painting a Black Lives mural with some prominent artists of color tonight and tomorrow. And then Broadway will be open back up on Saturday. So make sure you look out for that.
Great. Well, here's a couple questions that came in on chat, Jay. Who has the right of way on these shared streets? Are drivers supposed to yield to peds and bikes? How's it supposed to work?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so these are, probably most accurately thought of and described as shared streets. And so the barriers are intended to stop through traffic. And so local traffic, if you live on the street, if you order, takeout, anything like that, those vehicles are allowed. And so it really is a shared street. So bikes, ped vehicles, they all need to go slow and actually, provide yielding and everything for that. With that said, the intention really is to have biking and walking activity at the top. But that's not to say that cars are not allowed on here or that you have the right of way over a vehicle. They are just much more protected because they're in a car versus on a bike or on their feet. So they need to pay more attention. But really is kind of a shared space, but in a much slower, less vehicular traffic way.
Okay, a couple linked questions. How long will these stay in this configuration, these open and shared streets? And then how will the decision-making process work to continue this beyond the pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so we've had tremendous amount of success. This is the only project I've ever worked on where we have about near unanimous public and political support for these. And so we intend to keep them out for several more months. I think the exact date is really open to, what our recovery is going to look like. Is there a second wave? Is there a continued need for this? Are people going to be using them when it's cold and snowy or not? And so I can't really give you an exact date, but I can tell you they're going to be up for many more months. As far as the long-term impact, these really are temporary pop-up COVID responses. And so at some point they are going to go away. The city is working on a program on how we can use this data and this information that we are learning from this experience and actually turn that into new infrastructure development. And so some of these projects, they do overlap. Bayard and Marion, for example, that is projected sometime early next year to turn into a really nice, neighborhood bikeway and then a protected bike lane. And so by the time that these T-Rexes go away, some of these streets will actually turn into their future versions of themselves. And for others that don't have any plans for that right now, we kind of have to get back to the drawing board and figure out how we can improve them because they've shown that they're a success. And now it's up to us to actually make it permanent and act on that.
Jay, on Irving Street, I understand a pedestrian was killed a few days ago. Is there any change that's looked at in response to that tragic event?
Yeah, our Vision Zero team, in combination with DPD, are kind of still investigating, what was the ultimate cause of that, and was he in the street? Was he just using a crosswalk? That sort of thing. We do know from the data that we've collected, and then having worked with the council member and the community in that area, that the portion of Franklin south of Alameda, the street gets quite a bit wider, and there was still quite a bit of vehicular traffic on that area, more than we had intended. And so we are actually getting rid of that portion. We're going to get rid of about half of it where it's does seem to be a little unsafe. That decision was actually made prior to this individual in the crash. And so I don't know any details about that yet, but we're certainly going to use that data to kind of figure out how we can improve overall while we keep them out here.
Okay, we'll just take one last question because I know you've got to run to the Black Lives Matter mural. Are these projects changing the way you think about facilities that have previously been planned for these corridors?
Absolutely. A great example is Bayard. It's going to be a neighborhood bikeway. It's funded. We have put out counters to actually track some of the speed of the vehicles that are going on here to see what these traffic control devices are doing. And that can actually inform the permanent design. And so now we're looking at potentially more aggressive diversion. We could be dead ending some areas, mini traffic circles, chicanes, bump outs, those sort of things. And so this has been very much like a long-running pilot, so to speak. And so all of the data and the feedback we're getting from the community is going to go directly into future design and investment, and it's going to just make it that much better.
Great. Jay, where can people learn more or send in their ideas?
Fantastic question. Trying to think. I don't think we have a specific web page or email account for this. So if you just go to the DOTI website, there'll be contact information there, and they'll make sure it gets to the appropriate people for new considerations or ways we can improve current locations.
Great. Jay, thank you very much, and have a great event tonight.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Eager to chat in the future. So sorry I got to run early.
All right. And we have people applauding on video. Thank you. Thank you.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Okay, next we're going to have the first of our lightning talks. So lightning talks is something new we're introducing since we've gone to Zoom. We want to have quick updates. They're fast, but they should not be rushed. They should be focused. And so I'm going to bring up Jill Locantore's PowerPoint here. If I did this correctly, let's see. Right application, wrong one. All right. And Jill, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right, should I just get going?
Yep.
So I am Jill Locantore. I'm the Executive Director of the Denver Streets Partnership. We are a coalition of community groups advocating for people-friendly streets. Those of you who were paying attention a couple of months ago might have noticed that two of the founding members of the Denver Streets Partnership Coalition, Walk Denver and Bicycle Colorado, merged so that we could make the Denver Streets Partnership a fully staffed division of Bicycle Colorado. And so we are now Denver's Walk, Bike, Transit, and Safe Streets Advocacy Group. Next slide, Joel. So Joel asked me to share about some of the community surveying that we've been doing during COVID. Right after the mayor issued the stay-at-home orders, we put out a survey to inquire about how people are moving during this time and what their needs were. And we saw that the majority of respondents, nearly 80%, indicated that they are walking and biking as much or more now during the pandemic than they were previously. Next slide, Joel. And the primary reason was for exercise. We've all been stuck in our homes in Zoom meetings, and so getting out to walk and bike was more important than ever, but people were also using these modes to access food and essential services, and those essential people who still needed to get to work were using these modes as well. Next slide. And we saw that other cities around the world were starting to reclaim some street space or create some temporary bike lanes to provide more space for people walking and biking during COVID. So we asked if people were supportive of this idea, and nearly 90% were supportive. Next slide, Joel. And we asked people to suggest specific streets that they thought would be good candidates for reclaiming for walking and biking during this time. And we got suggestions for over 250 different streets around the city, which says to me that everybody has a street in their neighborhood that they think should be prioritized for walking and biking. We've highlighted on the map here some of the ones that really rose to the top of the list, with the most mentions highlighted in the darker blue colors. Next slide. So then, as Jay mentioned, the city acted very nimbly to respond to this demand for more space. We refer to what they call the T-Rex as shared streets, where cars are allowed local access, but the priority is for people walking and biking. City designated about 5 miles of the on the map that Jay showed, and this week they're designating an additional 2.5 miles. And then also we refer to open streets as the streets in parks that are completely closed to vehicular traffic. Those are in parks throughout the city, over 10 miles. Joel, next slide. Did he?
Yeah, Jill, you're kind of breaking up, but I've gone to the next slide, which has a pie chart on it. I think we've kind of lost Jill here. So I'm sure she'll rejoin us. We could just take a quick look through the rest of these slides. So a good mix of people living on, near, or not living near these streets, and where people have been trying out these shared streets. And the open streets in the parks, and how frequently. I'm going to take a quick look just to see if Jill's in the waiting room. No, okay. And then how frequently, what people like about it. Topping the list was quieter and more pleasant, and close second is easier to maintain physical distancing. Of course, that started the effort, but all of these rated very highly. And then how they can be improved. So we saw the logic for how these were chosen, but people were wanting better connectivity to parks and other destinations, better placement and barriers. Also very high on the list for shared streets, not of course as relevant for the open streets in the parks. And then should they continue? I think this is one of the main messages here tonight. Should these continue after the pandemic? Of the 733 responses coming up until a couple days ago, 86% saying yes, continue them after the pandemic.
Jill's back.
And I'm told that Jill has rejoined, so I'm going to ask her to unmute.
Hello, sorry about that. The internet kicked me off Zoom, but I'm back. Joel, you were doing an excellent job of covering the results.
All right,
on this slide,
yeah.
I would just point out only 5% of respondents said that neither shared nor open continue after the pandemic. There are about 10% that thought just one or the other, and 8% both should be continued even after the pandemic. Next slide. I also just wanted to share, we asked people to provide just open-ended comments on our survey, and it was tremendous, the effusive comments that people were making, saying how these streets were benefiting them. I won't read all of these, but we heard people saying that this made their life so much more peaceful during this stressful time. We heard from a lot of families that they were using the opportunity to teach their children how to ride bikes. They feel like this is one of the best things that Denver's ever done to improve our streets. Next slide. Here's a few more examples. We heard people were using the streets to commute. And again, it was making it less stressful. People felt like it was a great way to connect with their neighborhoods, even in this time of physical distancing. People could be out and together in this shared open space. And I love this last quote about designating the shared and open streets was an indication that the city of Denver had the interests of its residents at heart. How often do you hear residents saying that about their city government? Just really a strong endorsement of what a great program this was. Next slide. And then just one final thought I wanted to share with the group. One of the main feedback we got in terms of how the streets could be improved would be doing a better job of restricting through traffic on the shared streets. And especially during this time, there's been a lot of attention paid on how we tend to rely on police, people with guns, when we've got better tools at our disposal to be supporting public safety. And we completely agree in the context of streets in particular that street design is really the best way to improve safety. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated or expensive. This is an example from London, where they're also creating these shared streets with restricted through traffic. And they've put in these
Oh, seems like we've lost Jill again, but I think this was her last slide, and she did a great job as our first lightning talk, just coming in pretty close to the 5 minutes. Thank you, Jill, and I know she'll be rejoining. I'm going to stop the sharing and just get to our next lightning talk speech and cue it up, and this will be Bill Sirois with RTD, and Bill's going to talk to us about the impact of the pandemic on RTD. And I'm going to share my screen and share that. And then I'm going to go to Bill Sirois. Bill, are you still here? Oh, Bill Sirois. All right. Bill, you can unmute yourself. Welcome.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. I'm going to give you a little bit different story than the last two presenters and talk a little bit about transit, which hasn't fared as well as walking and biking during the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, we are on the verge of what I'll say is a crisis in the transit world. But let's go to the next slide, Joel. Or keep going, next slide. So just want to give you kind of indication of some things that have happened over the last several months. Many of you know that in January, our board made a recommendation to do an overall 3% cut, really to deal with our driver shortage. And they recommended that. We were moving forward with that. Then COVID hit in March. Then at the end of March, when we were starting to look into getting into our budgeting season, and some of us had some premonition of this, but looking at our 6-year budget, we felt there was a further need to cut service just because of our financial situation. So we were going into that, and part of the reimagine process, which I know I've talked to this group briefly about before, we were assuming that we were going to be about an 8% service cut in March. And then when we really looked at the impacts of COVID, and we saw about a ridership drop, about 67%. We're about a third the ridership that we were at pre-COVID. So we implemented a 40% service cut, which is essentially a Saturday service for bus and a Sunday service for rail in kind of mid-April, and that's where we're at today. So go next. So, as we looked at 2020 and have gotten more indication of impacts from sales tax and other things, we're looking at between a $220 and $280 million hit. Lucky for us, we did get some CARES Act funds, a fairly significant amount of funding from the CARES Act in the order of about $232 million. And so that is helping. But the other thing that we're doing on the transit side, and many of you may know this, we are implementing social distancing, physical distancing requirements on our vehicles. And that is reducing capacities pretty significantly. On a normal bus, 40-foot bus, we're having a max load of 15. On an articulated bus, we're having a max load of 20, and then on a rail car, a max load of 30. So those are roughly about 60% or 60% reduction in our capacity. So for every one vehicle that we have out, or every one vehicle that we used to have out pre-COVID, we really need 3 vehicles to carry the same amount of people. Next slide. So as we look at the kind of upcoming future and what's going on, we have some real major challenges. We are expecting a fairly slow comeback for transit. Transit and some surveys I know that we've done is rated as one of the least safe things to do in this pandemic. And so we fully expect that, people are going to be hesitant to come back, and we're trying to get prepared for that. And we have seen, like I said, our ridership has dropped off significantly, and it's kind of holding steady, but not really increasing that much. So really, and we're really going to be dependent upon the response of the virus. What happens with social distancing requirements, and the bigger thing right now is our finances. And 2021 that the figure I showed you before for 2020, we had the same thing in 2021. Our sales tax is projected to go down about 24-25% from where we expected it to be. Over the course of our 6-year financial plan, we're expecting sales tax impact of about $1.1 billion over that 6-year plan. So hugely significant impact on us budget-wise. And that's what we're discussing right now with our board, what that means for, our budget for next year and, and for the next essentially 6 years. Next slide, please. So going beyond that 12 months, what do we see happening on transit? Well, we're going to continue to add back service as our finances allow. And we hope, obviously, the virus is contained and the fear of riding transit goes away. But I think given our financial situation, to be realistic with everybody, we are going to have fairly significantly reduced levels of service next year, probably for the next couple years, and then slowly ramping back up to the point where, maybe 5-6 years down the road, we might get close to where we were at in January, but realistically, it is going to be tough for us to get there. So it is a real difficult time for us. Like I said, we are doing some major financial challenges. We are going to be looking at layoffs and furloughs and major project cuts here in this budget cycle. So it'll be something that's not going to be a fun process to go through. Next slide. So from a transit perspective, what we look in talking with some of our peers, I mean, they're experiencing a lot of the same things. I was speaking with some friends in the Bay Area, and they were giving me their BART situation, which actually is pretty similar to ours. And they actually have ridership at, I think, 7% of what their normal ridership is. So theirs is even worse from a ridership perspective. I think they're a little bit better financially off than us. But the unknowns in terms of what we have are really how are the riders going to come back? What things are the commuting patterns going to stay the same? Is telecommuting going to take hold and be a major factor in people's commuting patterns? Is there going to be new travel patterns? Do we know that? How is this going to impact development? We don't know those things. So those things are really going to be something that we're going to have to monitor and evaluate as time goes on. But again, fundamentally, we see transit as a core transportation function, and we are going to keep that core transportation function. It's just probably there's going to be less of it, and so we're just going to, get through this. But it is. I do want to make sure that people understand there is going to be a fairly drastic impact to transit for fairly, at least for the next 4 or 5 years, unless and the one thing that's kind of out there that is, unless there's that we do get some additional stimulus dollars, which obviously that could help. We're not counting on that, but we certainly would love to see more dollars coming from the feds, but I don't think we're planning on that, at least in the next cycle of stimulus bills. So that's my short presentation. So I guess I'll take a few questions if you have any.
Okay, thanks, Bill. We weren't planning to have questions for lightning talks, but I am very happy to announce that Bill has agreed to come to our next meeting to talk more broadly about Reimagine RTD with colleagues of his. Reimagine RTD being a much more comprehensive look at what the ideal network should be, and then how to scale that based on resources and other constraints, these really, really challenging hits to revenue that are going to be with us for a lot of years. So if it's all right with everyone else, just because this is our idea for, and I want your feedback, please send an email to transportation@denverinc.org if you have ideas for how to make this better. But the lightning talks are quick updates, and then at other times we'll have deep dives. So Bill's going to join us for a deep dive. I did want to mention, as we're transitioning from one topic to the next, and thank you very much, Bill. This is really, really sobering. We depend on transit as a city. Any big enough city can. People can't move around in cars. There's never enough space for that. So we need this to work, and look forward to meeting with you next month. I'm going to just mention that the survey that Jill talked about is open. If you go to bit bit.ly/shared streets. And I will put that into the chat for everybody. You can participate in the Shared and Open Streets survey. So I'm going to stop my screen, and we're going to go to our next and our second long form presentation. And this is David Pulsipher. David Pulsipher with Department of Transportation Infrastructure will be talking to us about how DOTI, the Department of Transportation Infrastructure, is continuing to do their projects, including public engagement, even in this time of social distancing. So let me share this and I will find David. David, I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself.
I just said, Joel, I added a slide. Would it be okay if I shared my screen?
We ran into some difficulty earlier, and at the moment, the only way I can allow someone else to share their screen is to allow anyone to share their screen. So you'll just have to speak to the missing slide.
Sounds good. Okay. All right. So thanks, Joel, and thanks everyone for having me. And forgive me if my neighbor is a race car hobbyist, and he just decided right now to fire up his race car. So if there's a dull roar in the background, that's what you're hearing. So tonight I'd like to just talk about two things. One was Joel invited me to speak to what DOTI is doing in the virtual engagement space during COVID. And then two, I also wanted to use this opportunity to talk about one of our big planning efforts and how it relates to our virtual engagement, the community networks. And some of you may be already familiar with this and others may not. So forgive me if you've heard some of that information before, but definitely wanted INC to know about it and give people an opportunity to ask some questions. So next slide, please. So the first thing I'll address is why are we still doing this? And in fact, we heard from some of our city council asking us to not do anything, to not talk to anybody, to pause and just sit in our homes and twiddle our thumbs. And we politely listened and then said, well, there's some good reasons for pursuing the path that we're on. And one of those being that just the demand for the work that we're doing hasn't changed. In fact, it's increased. And as Jay mentioned, with the T-Rex efforts, some of the work that we're doing is preparatory for T-Rex. And so we're finding there's a pretty significant appetite and needs to move the work forward. Secondly, we know that COVID has had a pretty significant impact on our economy. And when we keep our work going, it allows us to pay our vendors and contractors and help pay our consultants and other people. So it's just kind of, we're doing our part to help keep the economy moving. And then third, we're also using this as an opportunity to examine how we might engage with more people. And as it happens, we snuck a public meeting in just before everything was shut down. And we had about 50 to 60 people show up at this public meeting. And then a similar meeting we were doing in another part of the city. I think we tripled or quadrupled the amount of people who were able to participate. So we're finding that we're reaching more people, which is really great. Next slide, please. So just to give you a quick background, as soon as we started working from home and we knew that we wanted to keep the work going, we needed to quickly come up with some strategies as to how we would engage with the public and make it meaningful and do everything we can to remove hurdles and obstacles. So March and April, we sort of adjusted our planning efforts and made them fit to a virtual setting. And basically since April, we've been conducting the majority of our outreach in the virtual format. We're still calling people on the phone and having one-on-one conversations, but now we have entered the Zoom universe, and that's where we've been since April. Next slide, please. So just to kind of give you an idea of some of the formats we've been using, we use Zoom or WebEx just like this, where we'll do a standard webinar with some access control for people to participate in chat. What we do with some of our larger groups is we don't have the chat visible because we find that the chat can get distracting for people, and it's also hard to keep tabs on what's the questions being asked in the chat versus the presentation. So we'll frequently break up our presentations with places to pause, ask questions, and what we do on sort of the back end is we have a moderator like Joel is doing now, and then we have someone who we kind of call the point guard, who is going through the comments and clustering them together, grouping them in families, and then would say, "Hey Joel, we're getting a bunch of questions about public process. Can you have one of our panelists address that?" So that has worked really well for the Zoom WebEx. We're also using a technology called BroadNet Town Hall, which brings in some of the features of a Zoom or a WebEx webinar, but then also has a feature where we can call landlines. And this is our initial attempt to address some of the obstacles of the digital divide and not having access to the internet. And so the BroadNet technology will call out to landlines and give a brief message about what is being done, and if you'd like to participate, stay on the line. And we've had some really good results from that as well. Our BroadNet meetings brought in excess of 300 to 400 people. We were able to get a significant amount of Spanish speaking as a primary language participants, which is always a challenge for us in our planning efforts. So we're using that to try to address some of the shortcomings of not having a physical meeting. Then for some of our other meetings, and this is more like it would probably could be used in a format like this. We're using Microsoft Teams Live, which functions very much like Zoom. But what we do there is, people aren't muted and all of the chat and discussion can be seen. It also allows us to use breakout groups, which are really great. Everyone stays in the meeting, but then you can break into smaller subgroups and discuss individual corridors or topics. And we found that to be really successful. We've gotten really positive feedback in that. Next slide. So we definitely aren't experts yet, but we know a lot more now about virtual meetings than we did starting in March. So we, as I mentioned before, we have found it's removing some obstacles for people who want to attend meetings but don't have the time to carve out to come to an actual physical meeting are more able to participate in a virtual sense. Like I said, we've increased our Spanish speaking participation and removing physical barriers of individuals with mobility issues. That's this is obviously a win for them, and also it has allowed us to avoid some pitfalls with some public meetings where it can get uncivil and there can't be productive dialogue when people are more interested in hearing themselves speak than moving the conversation forward. We still are looking to supplement this with other efforts because we know there is the digital divide and not everyone has access to the internet at home. So that's where we're hoping the BroadNet can help. Also, a big part of this is it's easier in a one-on-one or face-to-face setting for people to feel like they've been heard. So we are working on that, trying to bridge that gap. Like, just because we're not in the same room doesn't mean I'm not listening and hearing you. And then let's see, I've got a pop up. Okay, I think, do you want to go? Let's go to the next slide, Joel. Yeah, so I want to stop there and just see if anyone had any questions. Is that okay, Joel? To see if anyone has any questions about virtual engagement or participation?
Absolutely, yeah. If you could just type your comments in the chat, and I'll pick some comments that seem to be popular. And yeah, I just had a format question. As I assume some people on the call, because we're transportation geeks, have been attending these meetings. I've attended some via Microsoft Teams, etc. It seems like one of the nice features there is, as you said, people can type in comments and then somebody can say, okay, that comment as a moderator looks like it's on topic. I'm going to let that through. But then everybody can see those comments and upvote them. So the more people agree with a comment, the more likely it will be addressed, or more people that want to see a question answered. Is that right?
I haven't used that feature in Microsoft Teams myself, but I have seen it. We have used that internally. DOTI did a town hall just addressing how we're adjusting to COVID operations. And I have seen that where it was basically an open stream of comments and you were allowed to like a comment. And so that is a really nice feature that Microsoft Teams offers.
Okay. Brittany from Wash Park West is asking for stakeholder meetings online. It would be nice to have additional meetings that really feel like you're collaboratively problem solving. I'm not sure which topic, which corridors, but have you had experience with going more in depth with stakeholder meetings, going deep into problem solving?
Yeah, so I have had experience with that, and that's where in our stakeholder groups, and we've used the subgroups and the breakout rooms, and that allows the subgroups to really get down into the nitty-gritty, focus on individual details, and I believe we'll be using that format for our subsequent stakeholder efforts.
I haven't seen any other questions come through, but let's move on.
Okay, great. All right, so yeah, and I just want to talk about community networks, and happy to discuss this big effort to my fellow transportation fanatics. So this is the big effort by DOTI right now, and forgive me, I didn't know how familiar or unfamiliar you were with the subject, so just wanted to at least provide some baseline information, and some of it will be a recap for you, and then basically an opportunity to answer questions as well. So next slide, please. So as if you're not familiar, what community networks is advancing multimodal projects in geographically, so that we can take advantage of opportunities that wouldn't exist if we were doing it in sort of a piecemeal way. We've divided the Denver into different community network areas, and the shaded areas you see, the colored shaded areas you see, are the first areas that we're focusing on. What we're doing here is we're looking at all of the projects that exist in Denver Moves Transit, Vision Zero Action Plan, Denver Moves Pedestrians and Trails, and Denver Moves Bikes, and see where there's opportunities to lump them together and to advance them. Something you may have heard come from various DOTI representatives is this idea of one build. So, if Denver Water is tearing up a street, that's a really great opportunity to do green infrastructure to make sure the utilities are all set, and to then repave the street all at the same time, so that we're minimizing the impact and disruption to a city, but then also being good stewards of public resources. So that idea of one build is translating into community networks and making sure that when we are doing something to a street, we know all the other competing interests or complementary interests, and we're lumping them together. A really good example of this is in the Northwest. That's the green area. Right now, at present, I believe it was 38th was recommended in Denver Moves Transit as a potential bus corridor, speed and reliability. But then it also happens to be a proposed bike lane. And when you dial a little bit down into the details, you notice that, you know, both of those things don't really work if you want to do them both well. So this is an opportunity for us to work with the community, talk about this, and then, you know, maybe adjust one of the recommendations. What we're doing is we're working with a collection of stakeholders in each of these areas, representatives from RNOs, the city council, neighborhood organizations, and other people designated by city council, from trying to business owners, community orgs, all kinds of different people to be sort of our canaries in the coal mine and let us know if you know, what the community sentiment is around different projects, things we need to be sensitive of, mindful of, to help us navigate these, because there are some difficult conversations that we're going to be having here. Next slide. Yeah, so I kind of addressed some of this other, but the main point of this is to really look at all of the transportation planning needs and in that part of the city. And the first phase of the projects that are going to be implemented are what we're calling our low stress bikeways. So these are neighborhood bikeways or protected bike lanes. The idea being that we really want to target the community that is what we call interested but concerned. When the Dr. Cog did their big survey and they surveyed the Denver metro region, they found that 59% of Denverites were interested but concerned in terms of riding a bicycle, meaning that they would like to, but they don't presently feel safe. So what we're trying to advance with these community networks is high comfort facilities that allows that majority of the population to have the choice to take a comfortable, safe bike network. Next slide, please. This just to give you a little bit idea of the timeline and where community networks came from. In 2018, actually, we started doing research and breaking up the different areas of the city by demographics and north-south connections. And we had several different factors that we went into putting the areas together. And then what we did is we bundled that, and we made some pretty significant spending promises in conjunction with a grant application that we made for People for Bikes. And we were successful in getting this grant. And the grant was awarded from People for Bikes to the Denver Streets Partnership and others to assist in the communication and the sort of proactive communications of this effort. One thing that's really been lacking in our ability to tell our story is that frequently we just have to pick up the hottest pot. We're very reactive, and this grant is going to be delivering some really high quality, positive messaging in the community network areas in the city that shows people what the city's doing and how you can support it and why it's so important. So we did a lot of that prep work and started our planning in 2019, and we are towards the end of the planning phase and are quickly moving projects into conceptual design for the bike projects. And we'll be advancing the bike projects into design this year, and hopefully with some things that can be constructed towards the end of this year. And then focusing a lot of, and our commitment was that we would try to be under construction with all of our bike projects by the end of 2021, while we still continue to work out and synthesize the feedback we're getting on Denver Moves Transit, Denver Moves PEDS, and Vision Zero projects. Next slide. So this is goes back to a little bit of some of our the part of this the part of the story that we haven't been able to tell was that, you know, finally we can actually get out and talk about why it's so important. They did some really interesting polling from a polling firm that found some messages that resonate with Denverites with respects to the trade-offs that it takes to providing more mobility options. So we've got a lot of research behind us, and you know, now with the help from Denver Streets Partnership, being able to have a really positive, proactive voice that will help people be aware of the actions we're making, so that you know, when it actually comes to parking being removed on a street, it's not the first time a business owner or a homeowner is hearing about it. They've heard about it and they understand the reasons we're doing these things. And what's really exciting is that you're going to be starting to see ads and hearing ads on Pandora and Facebook and Instagram. And it's really, really exciting. Something that the city has never had before, and really excited to be a part of it. Next slide, please. So something that we talk a lot about, and we are in the thick of it right now, and we call it weathering the political valley. You know, and support for our projects tends to be really great in plan, and as we design, and then as we near construction, the bottom falls out and people get mad. People start writing emails and petitions and threaten lawsuits, and then our city council gets worried, and our executives, the resolve can falter a little bit. And so what we're trying to do is, you know, create this awareness of this, and then also try to minimize this. And I think you can go to the next slide. I may have yeah. So what we're hoping is that this work that we're doing now will, we're still going to experience this time in the political valley, but we're hoping to minimize it with the amount of resources we're investing in, and informing our supporters and our advocates and the people who understand the importance of a multimodal balanced transportation network. That's a part of it too, so that you can have conversations with your neighbors and help people understand why projects happen. So that's what we're really hoping here. And again, resources that we haven't had before. Next slide. And we do really care, and we want this to be successful. And there's a couple of different ways we are measuring success. So, you know, obviously the number of miles, Mayor Hancock committed to 125 new miles of bike lanes. I think we are going to far exceed that. And if you look at the little picture on the side, what that shows right now is the percent of Denver that has access to a high comfort bike facility, which is about 37% of Denver. And when we're done with our community networks effort, Joel, you can advance. We will cover almost all of the city. And again, that's targeting that 59% of Denverites who want a high comfort facility, something that's easy for them to get to, that they feel safe riding with their elderly parents, or riding with their children, or just riding by themselves, that they never felt comfort before. That's really what we're trying to do. And this is not a new strategy. This has been recreated and done in other places all across the world with very successful results. You build better infrastructure and more people will use it, because the previous attempts and what just staying a normal course looks like is just doing more traditional painted bike lanes, and basically all you're doing is creating more access for people who are already biking like me. You give me a new bike lane, that's great, but I'm going to take my family and my children on that bike lane. We really need to change the kind of infrastructure we're doing. We also hope that, this process helps us do things quicker. We frequently hear from the community and from our elected officials, man, I just wish you would do things a lot faster. And so we're hoping that this creates a new channel for doing things quickly. We hope to be engaging with more people and find new champions and narrow that time between input and implementation. I think that might be the next slide, the last slide.
I think this might be it. Yep.
Yeah, so the only other thing I was going to say is we do have some pretty big things coming up. And is the chat open?
No, but I have some questions that have come in from the chat.
Okay.
If you're ready for that, or if you're going to announce some big
and then
things.
afterwards I can distribute a URL to the group that has where the more information is on the upcoming events relating to the community networks. So
great. If you paste that in to me, I'll pass it along.
Right.
We had a couple questions about online engagement. The first one is for people who maybe they have a computer or they have a smartphone, but they're not familiar with these tools. They're uncomfortable. They're not really technically savvy. Do you have any way to provide tech support or to recommend where they can find tech support to get them into the meetings?
So what we have been doing is in some of our meetings, we've been assigning a staff member to kind of help people with basically to be an unofficial tech support. And we will announce that at the beginning of the meeting, provide their email address and, hey, if you're having a problem, notify this person and they'll kind of try to walk you through things.
Okay, and then also on the online engagement, would you say that using online communication is speeding things up, or is it slowing things down, the amount of time it takes to arrange for it? And maybe this has to do with level of participation. What's your sense of how it's working on a couple dimensions?
Honestly, I would say it's about a wash. The time you save from having to remove logistics of finding a meeting location and physical supplies are made up in the developments of scripts and rehearsals and a lot of back end work to make sure that things go smoothly. We actually do spend a decent amount of time rehearsing and practicing so that things go pretty smoothly, and having plan A and plan B and plan C, we don't have to do that in the town hall or the public meetings because we're much more accustomed to doing that. So it's about the same amount of time commitment.
Okay, and how's the level of engagement, the participation? I heard anecdotally some of the meetings had much more attendance than similar. I think these were individual bikeway meetings.
Yes, yeah, I can say so. Like one, we're doing a paving project, a street resurfacing project in East Denver. The first meeting we had for that as a part of that project, I think we had about 59 people attend. And then the second meeting we had, twice that were able to attend. When we had our first Community Networks public house, our open house, we had 60 people attend. But then when we did the BroadNet and Zoom meetings, we had in excess of 400 people. So we definitely are talking to more people. I'm not under the pretense that all of it is really high quality communication, but we're reaching more people. So that's definitely a start.
Yeah, and more people will know somebody who knows about this.
Exactly.
I see that you put a URL in for me to pass along. Let me just verify this. It's ctnvirtualopenhouse.com, David, is that right?
Correct.
And what will people find there?
So that is where you will find information to the BroadNet meeting next week. It'll be held on the 17th. And then we'll also be posting, you can also find meeting notes, recording of previous meetings, and also we'll be providing subsequent meeting information and URLs there too. It's kind of your one-stop shop for our virtual engagement.
Okay, then we'll just wrap it up with two questions about the projects themselves. The first one, of course, with COVID-19 and sales tax dropping, is there any concern that funding shortfalls will impact the bikeways, the community bike networks?
Yeah, so we've been fortunate there, and we have maintained our level of commitments from the budget office to carry out this program. So we have not been impacted.
Great. And the second one, and this is a terminology thing, I think the bike program in the city of Denver has taught us as the public, different terms over time, a bike lane, a protected bike lane, a buffered bike lane, a neighborhood bikeway. And now there's this program that's a community network or community bikeway. Is there such a thing as a community bikeway? And if not, what is it? If so, what does it look like? And if not, what's the clarity on terminology?
Sure. I can break it down. So community network is just the idea of a collection of neighborhoods and them being in proximity to each other, and then and doing all of the transportation projects in that area, because it's not really effective if you want to move people to do a bike lane and have it not connect to anything. The idea being, if it's a network, it's all connected, and that we're doing all these projects in a really close and short amount of time so that we're rapidly improving people's mobility. And so it's just a term to kind of summarize that idea, that you're creating a community network.
Great.
Yeah, and with respects to like different bikeway types, I mean, I can get into that if that's what the question is as well. But
I think it had to do with this new term, the community bikeway. I think
so. Well, oh, okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, David. And I know this is running a little bit off the schedule that we talked about, but really appreciate you sticking with us.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks so much. And, I'm just an email away if you ever need anything. So please reach out.
Thank you. For everyone on the meeting, I will be putting up a slide at the end that reminds people the email addresses of the folks. And then because we're going to have an edited recording of this at the end, I'm going to spend less time on meeting notes and have just very focused meeting notes and get those out right away with contact information for our presenters. So now we're on to our last two lightning talks, and this one's fast and exciting. And I'm just looking for where the full screen is on this particular viewer, but that may or may not happen. View and enter full screen. Okay, that seems to work. And let me just find Avi and ask him to unmute. Avi, can you talk to us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Fantastic. Tell us about an update on bike streets.
Howdy, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to give you just a quick rundown. My slideshows tend to be a little bit quick-paced, so lots of slides, lots of turning, so apologies for the syncopation.
Yeah, you could just say go, we can make a song out of it.
Yeah, all right, go, exactly. Anyhow, so a little backstory for those who aren't familiar with the Bike Streets Project. Our goal is to get 100,000 people of all ages, backgrounds, and abilities riding bikes in Denver every day. Next. The project is powered entirely by volunteers. Here you see a group of folks that we convened a while back who are helping us design the neighborhood map that we have created of Denver. Next. And that map consists of about 400 miles of existing neighborhood streets and trails. You can get out and you can ride those streets and trails now, today. In fact, I did already today. Next. And to date, the online version of the map as of, well, I guess about 3 o'clock this afternoon had been used about 270,000 times. You can access this map at map.bikestreets.com. Next. You may recall that about a year ago, we ran a Kickstarter to actually print physical copies of the Bike Streets map. We printed and gave away about 20,000 in the course of 6 weeks. And we were well on our way to going forward with the second version of the map for this for this spring. Of course, global events got in our way, and we have put that on hold. But 20,000 maps are out in circulation. People are using them on an ongoing basis. Next. To date, we've taken more than 1,000 people on guided tours around the city using the map, using these routes, giving people a tactile sense of what it's like to be out there and riding. There's really nothing quite like the actual physical experience of being in these spaces, and it's quite remarkable, and I think that it's really a wonderful way for people to understand what this sort of abstract concept of the map is when you're actually out there in person. So if you haven't ridden some of these routes, I would really strongly encourage you to give it a go. Next. Perhaps you have been on one of these group rides. It wouldn't surprise me given the likely attendees in this call. Next. And in many cases, folks have, of course, gotten out and given it a go on their own. Next. And I think, candidly, the thing that I find to be so powerful about this network that we as a community have created is that these things, these assets are already there. You can go out and you can ride them. Indeed, in many ways, what we did was we took desire lines of routes, in other words, that people already use to get through their neighborhoods, and we kind of codified that into a comprehensive network. And really, it doesn't require a heck of a lot of modification to go out and ride today. I'm not suggesting that the routes are perfect by any stretch. There are workarounds and hacks and that sort of thing. But that notwithstanding, you can get pretty much anywhere in Denver today using the Bike Streets map. I've been using it now for about 2 years and have gone about 7,500 miles on it. And it's really transformed my own relationship with the city. Next. So I'm excited to announce that we are next, moving on with the next big step in the Bike Streets project. So we created first an online map, then we created a printed physical map, and next slide. Now we're going to work on bringing that to you on your phone. So if you go to the next slide, Joel, we have the Bike Streets map, you have your phone in your pocket, and together we hope that those in tandem, in combination, will be a loving relationship. Next. Which is to say that a group of volunteers has gotten together and we have built the first versions of the Bike Streets mobile applications. These are some screenshots from the Android app. Next. And here we have some screens from the iPhone app. Next. We're going to be launching it this week. It's kind of a soft launch. Given the circumstances, we decided that we wanted to just get it out there, get it on people's phones, and start getting some feedback. Next. And if you go to bikestreets.com/app, you can essentially pre-register for downloading the app. And as soon as it's available in both the Play and the iOS stores, we will send you an email saying, go get it, give it a try. Next. A couple things I want to just call out about the development of these applications. First and foremost, it is, as with the rest of the Bike Streets project, entirely a volunteer effort. Next. The app is 100% free. You will not see any of those disclaimers that say in-app purchases. Next. There are no ads in it, nor will there ever be any godforsaken advertisements in the Bike Streets app. Next. And we think that it's really important for us as software developers to set better precedents about how we treat data. And so the Bike Streets applications will never have these sort of weird, creepy privacy invasions that you've come to expect or just assume are part and parcel of using software products, including Zoom. Next.
Can we go just a little bit faster on these remaining ones?
Yep. The app is entirely open source. Next. If you go to GitHub right now, if you're a software person, you can actually download all of the source code. Next. And the significance of that is that any city around the world can give it a go. Next. which is to say that if anyone knows Anne Hidalgo in Paris, please let me know. We'd like to reach out. Next. We're just getting started. Next. We've done a lot of the work already to sort of set the foundation. What's complete is on the right-hand side. What is in the works is on the left-hand side. So there's much to be done. If anyone here is on this call is a software developer or knows software developers, please send them in our direction. Next. And I want to just quickly send a shout out to everyone who's carried it this far. Next. Lots of folks have participated in the software development. Lots of folks have participated in beta testing it. I want to just call out quickly and thank Joel for introducing me at the last Inc. transportation meeting where I presented. I met Mark, who is leading the iPhone software development. Next. So sign up and we'll send you an email as soon as it's ready for both Android and iPhone. And again, if you go to the next slide, the URL is bikestreets.com/app. So thanks so much.
Thank you very much. I think with the exception of having to ask me to advance the slides, whatever, that's the perfect kind of lightning talk and update. Love having speakers back who we've had before. We're making progress. You can keep the community informed. Thank you very much. I'm going to just go immediately to our last lightning talk. And this is Andrew Iltis. Andrew Iltis is with the Downtown Denver Partnership. And this lightning talk is about, well, how our bars and restaurants and other places can get more people to them, even during the time of social distancing. So I'm hitting the share button. I'm inviting Andrew to unmute himself. Andrew.
Okay.
Take it home.
All right. Thanks so much. Thank you for having me. My name is Andrew Iltis. I'm the Senior Manager of Mobility at the Downtown Denver Partnership. Let's just jump right in. Next slide. So tonight I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a program that the city has initiated. And it was something that the partnership advocated greatly because of some of these numbers that we saw right off the bat. This is data, and it's a little bit outdated at this point. I apologize, but it's from Google and Apple Analytics, where they started to see they saw a 54% reduction in activity. So this is trip activity to retail and recreation sites. And when I say recreation, I mean more of like gyms and those types of things, not necessarily parks. They actually have a separate category for that, which they saw an increase in trip activity too, but 54% reduction in retail activity. You can drop next slide. Some of the other things we saw is that, restaurants in Denver were reporting a 76% year-over-year decline in sales in April. And not too many of those restaurants were getting some of the funds that were made available through either the CARES Act or through local support for restaurants and businesses. So there was a lot of need out there for restaurants to have a bit of a jump start, have a bit of an advantage when they kicked back on. Talking to these restaurant owners, we know that it's really hard to figure out where that margin is, where they can actually start to be successful. And certainly without being able to provide, very minimal level of dine-in service or even just takeout and delivery, a lot of these restaurants aren't able to even get going to start to hire people back, hire kitchen staff back, or even buy food to fill their boxes, fill their freezer boxes. Next slide. Something that we believe in greatly at the partnership, Joel, we've had conversations about this before. You've experienced, I believe you experienced this probably exact scene. This is from Copenhagen, but what we believe very greatly is that our streets have this ability to take on another purpose besides just for private vehicle parking or private vehicle movement. And we have this unique opportunity right now where we have lower traffic volumes, as you've seen in these presentations, more people out on the streets. Why not be able to create some of these places for businesses to actually gain a little bit of that advantage back? Next slide. this isn't just happening downtown. This is a shot from Halloween where South Gaylord closes down the street and they have a celebration. Obviously, these people are standing. It's funny to see an image like this and you see everyone standing so close and you actually go, ugh, where are their masks? Which is a strange phenomenon I'm not quite used to yet. But this just shows that when we can create a space like this in a street, people will come and they will support our businesses and they will enjoy the places that that we need them to enjoy, to not only see each other, but to also support the economic activity of our business. And these are local businesses. I'm not talking about supporting our big commercial businesses either. Next slide. So things are moving fast, and the partnership, after talking with not just retail owners town and property owners downtown about potential to expand into the right-of-way, expand businesses onto patios, we also talked to other people around in the community, spoke with people on South Gaylord, spoke with people in Rhino. The partnership drafted a letter to the mayor on May 7th. By May 18th, the city had already created and initiated an outdoor patio extension. And, you know, within the next several weeks, couple weeks, the city received over 500 applications from businesses interested to expand their business outdoors. The state reopened businesses for seating, restaurants, I should say, not bars, but restaurants for seating up to 50% of their capacity, their indoor capacity, or 50 people. Now those numbers, they don't apply to outdoors. So if a restaurant is able to expand into space outside adjacent to their restaurant, they have a lot more capacity that they can seat people and provide that service. So this actually helps them get to that next margin. Next slide, please. So just wanted to show you, these things are coming in hot and heavy, and a couple of the ones that we're really excited about in downtown in particular, Larimer and Glenarm. These are, you know, screenshots of the applications that were submitted. We're talking about, you know, really repurposing entire blocks of streets for this activity to occur. And I think the really cool thing about this is that, you know, it's not just a way for these businesses to maybe get a little bit of a jump start, but it's a way for people to re-engage with the city. A lot of us have sort of disengaged or been very cautious, at least, to come back to public places. And these interventions are really giving us a place to expand, a place to re-engage, a place to kind of learn how to be with other people during this event. Next slide. Here's one that's already happening. This isn't necessarily an outdoor expansion, but South Pearl Street was quick to figure out how to do this. And, you know, I went down there, the event felt great. People were really excited to be out with each other. And so we know that there is a precedent to do this, even locally, and we know that the desire is there. And we're excited to see this type of feature really come to our streets and start to repurpose some of those spaces. Next slide. So I wanted to throw this message in. You know, we're almost now to where we have next steps. The city is moving, as I mentioned, very quickly on this, although we haven't seen a whole lot of applications approved yet. They've been dealing with a lot of things in terms of that right-of-way department in recent weeks. But we need to make sure we identify the risks of moving fast. We need to make sure that we're implementing in an inclusive and equitable way. And so as we see some of these applications get approved, it's really good for this group and for our group to stay engaged with how those are being approved and to make sure that we have a check on that equity and inclusivity point. We really want to be able to monitor and implement to adjust the program and provide support as we go forward. If there are things that we can do even in the near term, in the next month or so, to make this work better for people, to make people feel more comfortable, to make businesses be more profitable, we need to talk about those things, watch what's happening and learn from them. We also want to make sure that we're learning quickly from these environments. So, you know, Larimer and Glenarm, these are streets that already have local planning movement to actually change the street permanently. And so it's really important that we watch these projects and allow ourselves to think a little bit beyond emergency response, a little bit beyond recovery, and think to maybe, maybe this is a permanent feature that we'd like to have in our local streets. I think that's the last slide I have, Joel. Thank you so much for having me again.
Thank you so much. Thanks for sticking with us. We're just a few minutes over. I do like to run meetings to time, so thank you those who were able to stick with us. We're going to put up some simple notes about this meeting, links to the presentations, and then an edited video as soon as we can do that. We're moving to monthly meetings, and of course we're learning about using these new tools. Appreciate everyone's patience and interest in the ever-changing transportation environment. Please take what you've learned here, reach out to the contacts you've made. I'm going to put back up onto the screen the contacts for all the folks who are here who joined us today as presenters. There's email addresses. We'll just leave this up to end the meeting. And of course, take the lessons and information opportunity back to your neighborhood to take what you think your neighborhood should do to move forward and make it a reality. Thanks so much for joining us. And the meeting is over.